In the fluorescent glare of the youth facility, where the day is measured in counts and the nights in knocks on metal doors, Ronnie Harrell learned the grammar of survival. He arrived as a teenager with a suitcase of anger and confusion, a boy whose edges had been sharpened by neglect and circumstance. Inside those yards, the labels that define people outside, son, student, neighbor, meant little. The only currency that mattered was belonging. The Nazi lowriders offered that belonging like an island in a storm. A name, a code, a promise that someone would watch your back. For many young white inmates, that promise sounded like hope. For Ronnie, it sounded like a lifeline he could not refuse. Initiation was not a ceremony of honor, but a sequence of tests designed to break and then remake a person. Harrell learned quickly that loyalty was purchased with deeds. Smuggling contraband, enforcing debts, and answering orders without question became the shorthand of his new identity. Violence was not an abstract concept, but a tool, and he learned to wield it with the efficiency of someone who had only recently discovered that power could be bought and traded. The gang's rhetoric, angry, simplified, and brutal, filled the gaps of education and guidance he had never received. Racial myths, a narrative of grievance, and a doctrine that turned fear into ideology. In return, the lowriders taught him how to navigate the yard, how to read the unspoken hierarchies that govern survival, and how to become useful to those above him. As the years passed, Harrell's competence earned him trust. He moved from doing the gang's low-level dirty work to coordinating operations, becoming the conduit through which orders from higher-ups flowed. The title shot caller conferred more than status. It carried the responsibility of orchestrating the gang's daily economy, drugs, extortion, enforcement, and of making decisions that could end lives. With that role came a strange, intoxicating autonomy, the ability to command, to shape outcomes, and to be feared. To the rest of the prison world, he was a man who could get things done. To himself, he was someone proving he could matter. That need to matter, so common among those raised without anchors, was a powerful engine that drove him deeper into the life he would one day try to leave. The structure of white prison gangs like the Nazi lowriders was inseparable from the larger architecture of prison politics. They were not isolated cliques, but cogs in a broader network dominated by older, more powerful groups such as the Aryan Brotherhood. The lowriders functioned as intermediaries, carrying out tasks the Brotherhood wanted, distanced from its leadership. Smuggling operations, muscle work, and intimidation. Harrell's orders often came through layers of intermediaries. The chain protected the top while ensuring the gang's influence spread across facilities. This arrangement blurred individual accountability, and that ambiguity was useful, both for protection and for the perpetuation of business. Harrell thrived in that ambiguity. It allowed him to feel shielded and indispensable at once. Yet intimacy with brutality breeds a peculiar kind of erosion. The more Harrell enforced the gang's will, the more his private life shrank to the size of his assignments. Relationships became transactional. Sleep became fitful. Addiction found an easy foothold. The same substances he moved for profit became instruments for silence and escape. Drugs dulled the memories, numbed the conscience, and momentarily muffled the relentless hum of the yard, the buzzing alarms, the sudden shouts, the constant threat that a conversation could turn lethal. Each hit blurred the line between the man he had been and the man he had become. The price of seeming invulnerable was to become dependent on what had once been a tool. Within the gang, fractures began to show under the pressures of loyalty and profit. Power struggles, inflated egos, and paranoia made the internal world as hazardous as the external one. Harrell witnessed leaders betray followers, alliances dissolve over disputed takes of contraband, and trust weaponized into leverage. The ideology of purity and supremacy, once spoken as a rallying cry, increasingly served as a mask for greed and self-preservation. The promises of brotherhood that had drawn him in, protection, identity, purpose, revealed themselves as transactional, fragile, and often cruel. Those revelations did not come as a single thunderbolt. They arrived as a slow accumulation of small betrayals that undermined the bedrock of his faith in the gang. The accumulation of trauma, addiction, and cynicism led to a moment that loosened Ronnie's grip on the life he had built. After an operation that went wrong, an order executed that resulted in unintended harm, he found himself alone in a cell with enough silence to hear his own thoughts for the first time in years. In that quiet, the rituals that had kept him whole began to crumble. The veneer of control felt thin. He could no longer pretend that the ideological certainties justified the casualties he had accrued or the people he had hurt. That sense of moral accounting, delayed and relentless, was more frightening than any rival on the yard. It did not free him immediately. Leaving a gang carries practical dangers: retribution, surveillance, and the loss of the only social safety net he knew. Yet the realization that he had been complicit in a system that devoured men like him seeded a different kind of courage. Leaving when it came was neither dramatic nor clean. It began as a series of small refusals: a missed meeting, a refusal to take a contraband run, a choice not to escalate a fight. Each refusal risked reprisal, and each carried the weight of betrayal for those still inside the network. Harrell had to learn new kinds of stealth, not for domination, but for disappearance. The act of stepping away required him to make allies of strange forces: prison staff who observed patterns, counselors who provided alternatives, and other inmates who had also chosen a quieter path. Escape from the gang meant developing a life under the radar, finding ways to survive without the badge of the lowriders. It was a practical calculus of risk and reward, but it also involved the more profound challenge of rebuilding an identity that was not defined by orders and violence. Even as he distanced himself, the consequences of his actions followed. Old debts and old enemies did not simply evaporate when his allegiance shifted. Threats came in the form of whispers, challenges in the yard, and the constant vigilance that had become second nature. Harrell learned to accept that freedom would not mean safety. It meant choosing a different kind of fight, one that required humility rather than domination. In the privacy of locked nights, he began to name the cost: the lives damaged, the friendships betrayed, the opportunities squandered. This inventory did not make him a hero, nor did it absolve him, but it initiated a process: the steady, uncertain work of reckoning with a past that could not be undone. What transformed the calculus from mere survival to a possibility of change was the halting emergence of remorse, paired with practical avenues for rehabilitation. The same structures that had once funneled him into violence, group therapy, mentorship programs, and literacy classes, now offered an alternative education: how to speak about harm, how to manage trauma, how to accept responsibility. These were not cures, but tools. Harrell's early efforts at rehabilitation were imperfect and punctuated by relapse, yet they were real attempts to reorient his life. Slowly, reluctantly, he started to see a different future, not an erasure of the past, but a reconfiguration of how that past could be used. Instead of serving as proof of toughness, his story could serve as a cautionary tale. Instead of perpetuating harm, his knowledge of the gang's mechanics could be redirected toward prevention. Freedom arrived not with fanfare, but with confusion. When Ronnie Harrell stepped out of prison, the world he met was louder, faster, and stranger than the one he had imagined in his cell. The streets were lined with possibilities, but every choice felt like a trap disguised as liberty. For years, his identity had been dictated by codes and routines. Now there were no orders, no chain of command, and no one to fear except himself. He had dreamed of walking without shackles, but he hadn't understood how heavy, invisible chains could be. The habits of incarceration, scanning every room, standing with his back to a wall, distrusting kindness, were carved into him. Freedom, he discovered, was an environment that demanded skills he did not yet possess. The early months were a tangle of relapse and remorse. The substances that had dulled the noise in prison became a silent lure outside. Each time he tried to rebuild, he found himself haunted by the same restlessness that once led him to violence. Nights stretched into anxious hours where the mind replayed every moment of betrayal and blood. The gang world was gone, but the memory stayed vivid. The faces of the men he hurt, the shouts from the yard, the coded conversations that ended in tragedy. These recollections came uninvited, often wrapped in guilt and a craving for numbness. He returned to old vices not out of rebellion, but out of exhaustion. Survival and freedom, he realized, required a kind of emotional endurance he had never practiced. It was a hospital room that forced the first real reckoning. After a near overdose left him motionless on a gurney, Harrell woke to the sound of monitors beeping in rhythm with his heart. The sterile air smelled like second chances. He had been close enough to death to feel its indifference. Something inside him, perhaps stubbornness, perhaps grace, refused to die that night. He decided to live, though he did not yet know how. That decision took him to a rehabilitation center, where he was surrounded not by criminals or soldiers, but by men and women grappling with the same chaos he carried within. They spoke of loss, shame, and loneliness in ways that felt familiar. For the first time, he listened. Rehabilitation was a slow, uneven process. He sat in circles and learned to name the unspoken: trauma, guilt, fear, grief. He discovered that the violence of his youth had been not only physical, but emotional, a defense mechanism built around pain he never processed. In therapy, Harrell began unpacking his past, tracing the roots of anger back to the years before the gang, the fractured home, the absence of role models, the hunger for belonging that made him susceptible to hate. Each session was a form of excavation, peeling back the layers of myth he had built to justify his actions. Sometimes he wanted to quit, to return to silence and denial. But the alternative was a slow death by repetition, and he had already seen too many men die that way. What began as reluctant participation turned into quiet conviction. Harrell started speaking in group sessions, first about addiction, then about prison, then about the illusion of power that gangs offered. He noticed that others listened, not out of fascination, but because his honesty gave them permission to confront their own stories. For a man who had once enforced silence through fear, the ability to speak and be heard without violence felt revolutionary. His voice, once used to command harm, became a tool for healing. He found himself describing not just what he had done, but why he had believed it necessary. In that self-dissection lay the beginnings of redemption. Still, the pull of the old world lingered. Former associates reached out with veiled invitations. Easy money, loyalty tests, unfinished business. Some threatened, others pleaded. hoping to reclaim the man they once followed. Each message reminded Harrell how fragile recovery was. The past had a long reach, and its grip tightened when he felt weak. To counter it, he built structure around his life: meetings, routines, small goals. He worked menial jobs, kept a journal, and began volunteering at local community centers. These were humble steps, but they kept him tethered to purpose. He discovered that service, even in small acts, could quiet the restlessness that had haunted him for years. Over time, Harrell's story caught the attention of those outside the rehabilitation world. Counselors encouraged him to share his experiences publicly. At first, he resisted. He feared being reduced to a spectacle, a former Nazi lowrider paraded as redemption porn. But when he finally agreed to speak at a youth outreach event, something shifted. He stood before a room of teenagers, some already flirting with gang culture, and told them the truth. Not the cinematic version of gang life, but the lonely, paranoid, and self-destructive reality. He spoke of addiction, betrayal, and how every so-called brotherhood in that world eventually eats its own. The silence in the room told him he had reached them in a way no lecture could. That moment became a catalyst. Harrell began visiting schools, juvenile halls, and halfway houses, telling his story without filters or self-glorification. He did not preach or pity himself. He described his tattoos as hieroglyphs of poor choices, his scars as footnotes of arrogance. His honesty disarmed people. Listeners expected anger but found vulnerability. Many of the young men who approached him afterward admitted they had been seduced by the same promises: belonging, power, identity. Harrell realized that his greatest weapon against the culture of hate was not argument, but example. He embodied the consequences, and he was willing to let others see them. As the years unfolded, Harrell's work deepened. He partnered with prison reform advocates, lending his insight into how recruitment and manipulation operated inside the system. He helped shape educational modules for inmates preparing for release, focusing on emotional literacy and responsibility. His philosophy was simple: change begins with truth. He refused to sanitize his past, insisting that confronting it directly was the only path to genuine transformation. Through podcasts, workshops, and interviews, he became a reluctant public figure, a bridge between two worlds that rarely speak to each other. Yet redemption remained a daily labor, not a completed chapter. Harrell continued to wrestle with the residue of trauma. Nightmares still visited him, sometimes carrying the sounds of cell doors slamming or the echo of old orders shouted in anger. The difference was that he no longer ran from those memories. He faced them, acknowledging them as part of who he was without letting them define who he would become. He learned coping tools, mindfulness, writing, teaching, and used them to redirect the energy that once fueled violence into something constructive. The same discipline that made him a shot caller became the foundation for his sobriety and advocacy. Through these years of rebuilding, Harrell came to understand that his transformation was not a personal miracle, but the result of community. Counselors who refused to give up on him, strangers who offered second chances, and fellow recovering addicts who held him accountable. Their faith filled the gaps where his self-belief faltered. Slowly, gratitude replaced self-pity. He began to see his survival not as luck but as responsibility, a duty to make meaning out of the life he had nearly destroyed. Each time he told his story, it became a little less about guilt and a little more about purpose. Today, Ronnie Harrell lives in the open, but never without shadows. The tattoos that once declared his allegiance now tell another story, one of endurance, accountability, and transformation. Each mark is a reminder of what he once believed and what he now refuses to become again. He walks into classrooms, prison gyms, and community centers, not as a reformed saint, but as living evidence that people can change even after becoming instruments of destruction. His presence commands attention, not because of menace, but because of the calm gravity of someone who has walked through darkness and found a way to live with it rather than deny it. In every talk he gives, Harrell dismantles the mythology of gangs piece by piece. He describes how young men are seduced not by ideology but by loneliness, how racism becomes a language for explaining pain when no other vocabulary exists. He reminds his listeners that gangs do not recruit through logic, but through need, offering structure, identity, and a counterfeit version of family. When he explains this, there is no judgment in his tone, only recognition. He knows those desires intimately. They once ruled his own life. His message is not moralistic, it is practical. He wants to show that the hunger for belonging can either destroy or redeem, depending on where it is fed. Through the program he helped develop for inmates nearing release, Harrell tries to interrupt the cycle he once fueled. The curriculum pairs practical re-entry skills, resumes, interviews, financial literacy, with deeper emotional work. Participants write about their childhoods, their fears, and the people they've harmed. They practice empathy as a discipline, learning to listen without defense. Harrell insists that rehabilitation must include both responsibility and hope, to admit what you've done, and to believe you can still contribute something worthwhile. He tells them that freedom is not a date on the calendar, but a habit built day by day. The results are slow but visible. Some participants find jobs, others reconcile with family members. A few relapse but return for help rather than vanish. Harrell measures success not in statistics but in moments. A man deciding not to retaliate after an insult, a letter of apology sent to a victim's family, a parolee choosing to attend counseling instead of a party where old friends will be waiting. Each small act of restraint feels to him like a victory over the fatalism that dominated his past. Every changed mind is a quiet revolt against the machinery of hate. When asked in interviews whether he feels forgiven, Harrell usually pauses. He says forgiveness is not something he expects, it is something he works toward. He believes in accountability more than absolution. You don't erase what you did, he says. You outgrow it. That philosophy shapes everything he does. He no longer seeks to prove strength through domination, but through consistency, showing up, telling the truth, staying sober, mentoring others. He knows that some people will never accept his transformation, and he does not blame them. What matters is that his actions no longer add harm to the world. The threats, however, have never entirely disappeared. Former associates still view him as a defector, a traitor who broke the unwritten laws of silence. Occasionally, he receives messages reminding him that walking away from a gang's never truly done. Each one is a test of resolve. Harrell responds by continuing his work, believing that fear loses power when met with purpose. If they take me out, he once told a journalist, they'll just prove my point, that this life only ends one way. I'd rather live showing another way exists. His courage is not loud. It is deliberate, a quiet refusal to retreat. Beyond personal redemption, Harrell's story has become a case study in what criminal justice reform can look like when rehabilitation is prioritized. His testimony before panels and advocacy groups challenges the idea that some people are beyond saving.